I finished Cloud Atlas. I'm a bit nervous to talk about this one because I know how much some of my book friends adore it. I don't dislike it. In fact, I liked it a lot. But is it entering like the pantheon of books that have changed my life? No, admittedly, no. And that's not to say that it wasn't clever, entertaining, unique. It was all of those things. I just think it's so high concept that at times I found it a bit alienating, if that makes sense. Like it kind of, the audacity of it to be such a unconventional narrative kind of got in the way of my satisfaction with the story. But I'll explain what I mean. I actually think this is a case where I enjoyed the author more than the book. Like I'd be curious to see what other books David Mitchell has penned, because I feel like this is someone that should have already been under my radar, and now that I've read this I can appreciate like, oh, people always tote this as your magnum opus, but maybe that's not necessarily the case. I feel like he might have other books that I would appreciate more. I've not read any Italo Calvino either, so when he cites his main inspiration as the book If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, I'm not familiar with how that book operates. I'm sure it's very similar to Cloud Atlas, but I would like to think that that book does a better job in certain stylistic choices, which for me just weren't it. I think my biggest issue was that the whole thing's a boomerang. So we have these 6 lives, and it's mainly people watching. You go in and out of these 6 people's lives, and you see as time passes the evolution of language, the evolution of predation, how one person, you know, takes power from another. And while all of that was fab, for me, having 5 of the 6 stories split into 2 halves made it very difficult mentally to keep a track of everything. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of pages in between the first and second half of each of the first 5 lives. So by the time you get to like Adam Ewing's second half, I'm like, what's your name again? Like, who are you? I couldn't. I really couldn't. And I understand that attempts were made to make each character's events stand out more in your mind. Like every single life is written in a different genre, in a different format. But this was an exhausting book, and it was borderline sadomasochistic on the way that it edges you out for that second half, because some of these lives you get right to the rising tension where you're really properly invested, and then boom, you don't get to hear from them again for another 300 pages, and it drove me mad. Let's get through all of the lives. So life number 1, we start and we're in the 1850s. We're in the South Pacific. Adam Ewing, we're reading through his journal entries. This life, we started off poor because David Mitchell has said that one of his biggest inspirations for writing the first life was Moby Dick. Fun fact about me, I hate Moby Dick. So while I think he did a good job of distilling Melville's style of writing into that first life, couldn't stand it. I was like, please, Lord, get me out of this first life. I liked it more when we went back on the second half, and I thought that ending line was really impactful. What was it they said? Like, in your dying breaths, when you realise your life is just a few drops in a limitless ocean, but like any ocean is just a multitude of drops. Like that, I wish there was more of that, because there was profundity, but it was sort of scattered through each of the lives. I could have done with more of that, because the book is getting into the deep, like, why of it all, why life, but for the most part it's just people watching. And I didn't need the order of events to be one big circle. I would have been fine if it was just life 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I understand that his whole impetus to write this was to be unconventional, but I'm a bit tired of the story where we start somewhere and then the ending returns back to that same place. Like, I'm good. Especially when your book's about time. Time only moves in one direction. I don't need you to go back and forward like that. But that's just me. Life number 2. God, this is a very hard review to do because there's so much going on. This is really like a kitchen sink of a book. Like, I can't imagine the poor publisher that he had to pitch this to. They're just like, oh, David, you're going to do what? So I'm going to try and fit in everything I have to say about it, but there's a lot to unpack. So life number 2, We're in Belgium. It's the 1930s. Robert Frobisher. I liked this one a lot. It was very like scandalous affair drama, like a bit of D.H. Lawrence, but then the second half was very like Dostoevsky because the main character has some demons and like, you know, is very traumatized. I think there's a lot of homoerotic repression as well, which we could have explored more because I'm a sucker for that. But yeah, I liked the second one. He said his main inspiration was a book called Delius. I'm not familiar with that. Life number 3, we are in the States, I believe. It's the 60s. It's kind of like a John le Carré espionage type story. And it's... Oh, the second life, by the way, was told through letters. The first life was journals. This one is like a expose sort of article style of writing. And Louisa Ray, this was actually so dramatic, and the way that the first half ended, this was where I was the most annoyed, because it splits and I'm like, no, I need to see what happened to her, and you have to wait hundreds and hundreds of pages to find out, and I was so mad. And I think my frustration as well comes from, if each of these 6 books was an individual novel, I would thoroughly enjoy most of them. But when you sort of compound them all together, for me at least, you're not able to appreciate each of them in their entirety. And that was a real shame, because if this was like a book series where each life was a different book, I think I would appreciate that more. As a standalone novel, it just felt, pardon my French, like a clusterfuck. Life 4, my favourite life, Timothy Cavendish, obsessed. Okay, this one is modern age, and I think that helped because you could tell he wasn't having to make any extra effort to sort of fit the time and place of where he was writing. It was just like as he is. But regardless, it was like The Hearing Trumpet meets like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was like this perfect black comedy of a man that is mistakenly trapped in like a retirement home. And it was so funny. Loved it. Thought the second half was even better. The way it resolved. My favourite life by far. I mean, if this had just been a standalone novel, 5 stars. Loved it. Now, Life 5 is where we get into science fiction and dystopia, because it's Sonmi 451. We're like thousands of years into the future, and we're in Korea. Now, at this point, we're about 300 plus pages into the story, and I think sci-fi and fantasy, world building is difficult at the start of a story. At this point, where I've already got 3 other character arcs in my head, I was ready to have like a hemorrhagic stroke. I was overcome. But I did still really like Life 5. It's formatted as an interview. David Mitchell really made me laugh in the afterword, where he said he opened an OK magazine for the first time and was inspired by a celebrity interview. It was kind of giving me Clara and the Sun, because it's all about like artificial life. But that was then funny, because in the afterword, David Mitchell talks about having a conversation with Ishiguro, who was the one who like encouraged him to reinvent his style of writing. So that was, I did like this life. And lastly, the 6th life, post-apocalyptic, we're with Zachary, Slusha at the Crossing. Didn't love this. It was very Clockwork Orange, where you were showing the passage of time through this very mangled new form of language, but it was difficult to understand. I found this bit very hard to follow. I didn't mind it, but it was not one of my top 3 lives. If you've made it all the way to the end of this review, power to you. I mean, again, I can't stress enough, I did like this book, but for me, it's not a 5-star read because there was just so much. I think if I come back to this years and years in the future, I will enjoy it more.